Last time on the video about the dome, I talked about how people get angry when they're programmed, how they get really angry and they don't want to look at it, or else they will get offended, or there will be some type of a really negative emotion that will happen. And that was what happened to my family when it came to the flat earth. And I know most of you guys encountered that same type of phenomena when you were talking to people about the flat earth. And looking whether the 1,000-year reign has happened or not seems to be the same kind of phenomena happening here. And a long time ago, and I know you guys have all heard this, but God has told me that if it gives you a strong negative emotion like fear or anger, to look. And if this is true, it really does need to be known, not swept under a rug. I guess my first video about whether the 1,000 years had happened was about a year ago now. And did I ever receive fear and anger? Unfortunately, I thought it would have softened by now, but unfortunately, it seems like there's been a resurfacing of this fear and anger. And so, because God told me to look, I'm going to present the information that I found. And I actually haven't been looking a whole lot lately, except for, sometimes He leads you to look again in an area, or you didn't even know. I was watching a video about something else and I stumbled across this YouTube channel. And boy, are you going to get a whole lot of information that you didn't know before. Enjoy.
All right, shalom, everyone. Welcome back. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Unfortunately, I was supposed to bring on Rick Hummer tonight, and he just texted me a little while ago and said that he had an emergency edit for a client that's looking. He does like video editing and recording, and anyways, yeah, he said it's going to take him all into the early morning, and he has to have it in by tomorrow morning. So he's really bummed because he really wanted to come in and talk about this. He's been talking about it for months. He wants to get this out to people. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue with the talk tonight, and I have stuff prepared. And what we'll do is next week we're going to plan to just continue with the Targum study. And if he's able to make it, then great. We'll continue with the millennial reign 70 AD mud flood talk, and just go from there. Does that sound good to everyone? All right. So now I was hoping tonight would be kind of a conversation between Rick and I, because he's got a lot of just great information on the mud flood. In fact, he was the guy that got me into it. For those of you, the reason I wanted to bring on Rick Hummer tonight, Rick Hummer was the MC at all three Flat Earth International conferences. The first time I met him was in Raleigh in 2017. And then in 2019, my wife and children and I were living in Europe. And we were going through all Europe for several months. And one of the things I was targeting was old buildings. And I was going all over there. I was looking mainly for the occult and trying to find how they, particularly in like the Age of Enlightenment and so on and so forth, how they constructed their buildings and why. And as I'm online and I'm posting pictures of this stuff and talking about this, I had like back then, it's really the mud flood was still kind of in its infancy. And not a lot of people knew about it. It hadn't taken off yet, but I had all these people coming on and telling me, oh, that's all fake history. And they were, trying to cover up free electricity and all this kind of like, what are you guys talking about? So I go to the Flat Earth International Conference in 2019 in Dallas, and I spoke there. And I'm standing at the bar with Rick, and we're just talking, and he's like, bro, like you gotta look into these buildings, like they've got these basements that have doors at the bottom. I'm just like, I was trying to figure out like what he was talking about. And long story short, Rick was the guy who got me into the mud flood. So, anyways, he might drop by tonight, and if not, that's cool. He'll come by hopefully next week, and we'll do it again. So, one of the things last week, I gave a little bit of a preview as to what we'd be talking about with 70 AD and the prophetic connotations as to where we're at on the calendar. I don't know if I need to repeat that for anybody. We can go over the details again. Would anyone like me to kind of go over that again?
A brief refresher would be dope.
All right, a brief dope refresher. So, as you guys know, well, let's talk about the mud flood real quick. I live in the city of Charleston, or just outside the city of Charleston. I live on a what is currently an alligator preserve, and I was kayaking today, and I had so many alligators jump at me and were like, "Get in my mouth!" It was really kind of creepy in that kayak. I was out there alone, thinking, "Man, like if something happened to me, how long would it take people to realize I'm not coming back to look for my body?" But anyways, that's where I live. And so my next door neighbor is what's considered the oldest house in South Carolina history, according to the official narrative. In fact, it was a plantation home that rebelled or fought against. Let's say they lost both wars. They were originally for the Patriots. The Loyalists. They were originally with the Loyalists fighting for the crown, lost that, and then they were for the Confederacy, of course, lost that as well. And the driveway the road that leads up to the house with the double row of grand oak trees that you'll see in famous like South Carolina photos is actually what I have to drive down to get to my house now. So keep that in mind. And about 3 or 4 months ago, I decided to take my Sabbath group down to Charleston on a field trip, on a mud flood field trip. This had been the first time I'd been to downtown Charleston since COVID-19, the whole outbreak. And, as you guys know, it's like depressing to go outside nowadays. We were actually threatened by security there to get $100 fine each if we didn't put on masks. We refused to put on our mask, and, nobody was fined. But we were walking around, and I didn't really know what we would find down there. But we were going down there looking for mud flood architecture and proof and so on. As soon as we parked right in the old historic district there, I parked with Dave, who's in this group, and he immediately pointed my attention to an arch in the wall, a bricked arch that was about 2 feet above the sidewalk. And we walked over there and we're like, oh my goodness, that's a door, and it's buried. They put a sidewalk over this door. And we started walking down the street, and we started seeing these bricked in arches and windows everywhere. And finally, within about an hour, as we're going on every street and finding this stuff, we found the biggest find was we found a huge arch door, the kind that like horses could walk through. And it was about 2 feet off the ground, and they left the door hinges on. The door hinges were still there, and they just put a street over it in a building. And the second story of the building is now the first story of the building. And we're just like, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. We go across the street and we start pulling up these grates in the street and looking down and seeing that the original street of Charleston was 12 feet down. We could see the original doors still there on these buildings. And we're asking ourselves, where in Charleston is the city that, it was the city that basically started the revolution, according to the official narrative. And it was the city that started the Civil War, according to the official narrative. And I'm looking at this going, where in the world did the mud flood happen in this narrative? Paulie just signed in. About 2 or 3 weeks later, we're driving down to where he lives. And we go to his city, and again, we're seeing all over just like these doors and windows that are buried underneath the sidewalk everywhere. It was worse there. And my wife was pointing it out and saying, look, that's not how you build buildings. You don't build buildings underground, or where the door is only like protruding out of the sidewalk, right? So this is what we're looking at with the worldwide mud flood. There was this huge event that destroyed civilization, and they covered it up and they rewrote history. They buried it, right? History is buried. And this week, what I wanted to do was look at the Enochian calendar. Enoch has a prophetic 10-week calendar, and I'm going to go over those details real quick and see where we could find. Oh, let's talk about quickly 70 AD. And
sorry,
go ahead.
Quick question. Just before we move on from the mud flood, what would be the speculated time frame that would happen in? Like, how old were these buildings? And obviously, if history's been kind of overwritten or like kind of hidden, it'd be good to be able to put kind of like an estimated kind of time frame on that, and I guess dating those buildings would give us a pretty good indication if they're 300 years old or 250 years old. Then it could have happened within the last 250 years, I would imagine, right?
Well, that's what I want to get into. And when we look at the calendar, before I look into how old these buildings are that are buried over on every continent on the earth, and they just basically, they just paved over the streets, story up, and started from scratch. I will say really quickly, as you guys probably know, the mud flood hasn't really taken off in the worldwide consciousness yet, like Flat Earth did, and so it's actually a beautiful time to research mud flood because AI and algorithms and so forth are not burying these searches. You can look up whatever you want in the mud flood, and you will get the stations and videos and websites that you want, because Intel is not trying to bury it yet. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of explanations, and I think they're sweating bullets right now because I don't know if they know how to explain this away. The only official explanation I've gotten that I've seen is people saying, well, and if you don't sweep the front porch of your house for 200 years, the dirt will accumulate to the first story. And it's like, oh yeah, that must explain it. It's like, oh, sorry, honey, we didn't sweep the front porch for the last 200 years. Why not, instead of digging ourselves out, why not just build a new front, door on the second story? That's so far all I've seen to explain away the mud flood. So it will be interesting to see as this gains more and more traction, because mud flood stations now that are fully devoted to this, like they've gone in the last year from like 10,000 subscribers to like 150. Like it's exploding right now. So the where this ties in is with the before I get to Enoch's calendar. Actually, let's just start with Enoch's calendar, then we'll dive into 70 AD. So Enoch's calendar, it's a prophetic calendar of all of human history that takes place over 10 weeks. Most people, it seems like the general assumption, I think it's a good assumption to make, is that Enoch's calendar, each of the weeks represents 700 years, give or take. Because if you take 700 times 10, you get 7,000. Makes sense. If there's, a week of history in 7,000 years. If you look at most of the calendar appears in chapters 91 and 93, and it's the 6th week. Let me read the 6th week to you, and this is where our launching point will be. Chapter 93, verse 8. If I can find it. And it says, and after that, in the 6th week, so after the 5th week, all who live in it shall be blinded, and the hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom. And in it a man shall ascend. And at its close the house of dominion shall be burned with fire, and the whole race of the chosen root shall be dispersed. All right, so this is an amazing prophecy. I mean, this was clearly written long before the 1st century. And this just, has like people pissed because it's so accurate. I mean, who is the one person that ascended in the 6th week. It was Yahusha. Yahusha ascended. Nobody else ascended. At the close of the 6th week, the temple is burned, the house of dominion. That's 70 AD. And the whole race of the chosen root is dispersed. Yehuda, the tribe of Yehuda, is dispersed, right? Israel's already been dispersed. So now Yehuda is dispersed. This is the closer of the 6th week. So this is where we find, so this is 70 AD. And 70 AD is the year where I believe that the resurrection happens. In fact, Enoch chapter, Enoch chapter 91, verse 10 says, it talks about, it doesn't really tell you exactly what week the dead will rise, but it says, and the righteous shall arise from their sleep, and wisdom shall arise and be given to them. And this is during a lot of turmoil. So one of the things that started culminating with the mud flood research or coming together was this idea of, I can't stand the term, I'll think of it. What is it? Where people, whatever. I can't think of all the doctrine terms, but in 70 AD, Yahusha's coming around 30 AD or whatever, and he's standing there and saying that there's going to be people who are standing there who aren't going to taste death. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And you look at the whole New Testament, it's written in a sense of haste, whether it's even the writings of Paul, by the way. But if you look at James, Jude, Peter, John writing Revelation, all of it is like, guys, it's about to swiftly come to an end. Like, it's coming to an end now. Like, we need to get this. Like, you're not getting a chance next week. The master's returning. Yahusha's there saying, some of you aren't going to taste death. There's a couple we had discussed, I think, a couple weeks ago, that in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, it's really interesting that the word for this and that is the exact same word. It's really interesting. So that kind of you could argue that throws a wrench into the argument. I don't think it does. So Yahusha, is he saying this generation or that generation, right? Or both? Maybe it's both. Maybe the prophecies refer to both. But, he goes over there to the high priest on the night he's betrayed, and he says, you will see me coming down in a cloud of glory. He tells his own disciples, he says, you guys will not flee to every city in Judea before I come back for you. He doesn't say some future generation will not, flee to every city in Judea. He says, you will not. And so that's kind of the framework we're working with here, that I believe that he did come back for that generation as promised. And this is why all the death stories of the apostles are really shady. They really don't start appearing for 300 or 400 years later by the Roman Catholic Church. And a lot of them are contradictory. You have multiple different takes on it. Now, it's possible that Kepha, Peter, really was crucified around 64. I could deal with that. But I think most of the others made it out of there. So we have multiple quotes from Josephus. If you read my article, you'll know about this already. But it's funny because a lot of people, you try to explain scripture to them and they won't believe it. They're like, I don't care what scripture says. I need historical proof, right? It's like, okay, you want historical proof. Well, let's go into the famous Roman whore Josephus and see what he has to say. This is him accounting the War of the Jews, and the War of the Jews started in 66 AD. It's a perfect 3.5-year fit with the book of Revelation. So I think the book of Revelation really kicked off. It was written before 66 AD. It's probably written in the early 60s, delivered to the churches in haste because the time was quickly arriving. And this is one of the things that Josephus says. On the 21st day of the month of Iyar, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. The Jewish historian Sefer Yosipon talks about the same event, and he says, moreover, in those days, we're seeing chariots of fire and horsemen, a great force flying across the sky near to the ground, coming against Jerusalem and all the land of Judah, all of them horses of fire and riders of fire. And this seems to be a prophetically spoken of in Isaiah chapter 66. Remember, Isaiah 66 is the big chapter of his return. For behold, Yahuwah will come in fire, and his chariots like the whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. And then there's a first century Roman historian, Tacitus, and he has this to say of the same event, 66 AD. In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. A sudden lightning flash from the clouds lit up the temple. The doors of the holy place abruptly opened. A superhuman voice was heard to declare that the Elohim were leaving it. And in the same instant came the rushing tumult of their departure. I think right there, that's actually documenting the resurrection of the saints. In fact, I believe it was Josephus, and I don't know if I put that quote in this article, he had mentioned that earlier those voices were heard under the temple, under the altar, just as it says in Revelation chapter 6, and they were crying out to be released. And so here we actually see the voices under the altar in the temple being released before it is destroyed. So there were some real surreal, crazy things that happened in 66 to 70 AD. And my theory is that Yahusha literally returned in the clouds, that he was seen by the elites, and these people were like, oh crap, this is the guy we hung from a tree and crucified, and he's back, and he's got a bunch of fiery dudes, and this isn't good. And we've got to cover this up. We got to erase this. We got to do whatever we can to cover this up. So getting back into Enoch's calendar, we know that the closure of the 6th week is, and keep in mind too that when we're dealing with the end days, technically once you get past the 5th week, weeks 1 through 5 is the beginning of days, and then weeks 6 through 10 are the end of days, right? So, from Yahusha really came in the end of days. In fact, when you read the New Testament, you get that perspective that they're in the end of days. So the 6th week ends with the temple being destroyed. And this leads us into the 7th week, which is the week of apostasy. In chapters, let's see if I can find this here. Okay, and it says in Enoch chapter 93, and after that, in the 7th week, shall an apostate generation arise, and many shall be its deeds, and all its deeds shall be apostate. Now, if you speak to anybody out there in the matrix, they're going to tell you that we are still in the 7th week. They're going to say, well, dividing up the calendar into weeks of like years of 700 doesn't really apply to us because it's been an ongoing 2,000 years, and we've been in the same week for that long. We've been in the age of apostasy. They don't really want to venture past that. But what we will find, hopefully, is that if we carry his calendar through, we're going to find that we're just about in the 10th week. We've gone a long, long ways into this. And I think prophecy looks very, very different than has been advertised to us through the Tim LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, like it's going to be like the 7-year showdown. And then it's all going to, all eyes will see him and they're all going to be sorry. And that's it. And it's all over. And, and so on and so on. Like that the end days, the way prophecy goes down is never exactly like we think it will necessarily. You can look back in hindsight and go, yeah, Yahusha, he makes total sense. But, it clearly, as we're told, according to the official narrative, it didn't go down the way people thought. They thought the Messiah was going to show up and be a conquering lion, right? He came as the lamb. I ask people as we go into this, see what the church does is they say, well, okay, yeah, the Jews thought it would be a one-time event. We think it's going to be a two-time event. My perspective, looking at prophecy, is going, well, what if it's a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 8, 9, 10 part event? What if this is something that is just an ongoing story that, hasn't reached its climax yet, but it hits a lot. There's been a lot of peaks and a lot of valleys in between. All right, so the 8th week, let's see here. The 8th week, it's really interesting. So if you can think of the 7th week as the age of apostasy, this would follow 70 AD exactly and continue on for another 700 years, in which case we can look at history and go, yeah, that makes sense. Rome was in control. You could probably wedge a lot of history into those 700 years. And what happens at the end of it? Rome falls, according to the official narrative, and we enter into the Dark Ages. This is when we enter the 8th week, when we go into the Dark Ages. And in Orwellian language, they like opposites, right? Kind of like how America is the new world, right? You just switch it to it's the old world, right? The Dark Ages was the Light Ages. The Age of Enlightenment was the Age of Darkness, right? So, so the 7th week. Okay, then let's see. Where's the 8th week here? What's weird is that Enoch's written out of order, so I got to go to chapter 91. All right, that's not it. Oh boy. Okay, here we go. Okay, so after the 7th week, so this is interesting too. That this is where I messed up. So it says that somewhere in the 7th week, it could be at the beginning of the 7th week, the end of the 6th week, or somewhere towards the end of the 7th week. We really don't know. But according to Enoch's calendar, in the 7th week, that is when the righteous shall arise from their sleep, and wisdom shall arise and be given to them. Because it says after this, there will be another week, the 8th week, that of righteousness. Now listen to this, because this is really trippy when you get into Tartaria territory. And a sword will be given to it, so that the righteous judgment may be executed on those who do wrong, and the sinners will be handed over into the hands of the righteous. This may be seeing the destruction of Rome. And at its end, they will acquire houses because of their righteousness, and a house will be built for the great king in glory forever. All right, so this is where we get into the millennial reign territory. We're clearly in the millennial reign now, and we see that in this 8th week, houses are built for the righteous. All right. Then in the 9th week, after this is the 9th week. The righteous judgment will be revealed to the whole world, and all the deeds of the impious will vanish from the whole earth, and the world will be written down for destruction, and all men will look to the path of uprightness. And after this, in the 10th week, in the 7th part, so keep in mind that if you're dividing up the millennial reign is 1,000 years, but these weeks are 700 years, which means the millennial reign will go into 2 weeks. So the millennial reign will start some point in the 8th week, and it will continue on probably towards the end of the 9th week, the age of righteousness. So at the beginning of the millennial reign, the houses for the righteous are built, and it continues on into the 9th week. And after this, in the 10th week, in the 7th part, there will be an eternal judgment that will be executed on who? On the watchers, and the great eternal heaven that will spring from the midst of the angels. All right, so in here, and this is where he talks about the new heaven, the new earth will come down at the end of the 10th week, at the judgment of the watchers. So it's my contention, of course, that the watchers have been released, and it says that earlier on in Enoch, unfortunately, I didn't write down the verse here before the study, but it says that when they were put into the hills and the valleys of the earth, around, 700 years after creation, or I don't have the dates in front of me, that it would be for 70 generations. All right, so this is, what is 70 generations? Is it talking about 70 jubilees, 70 years of 70, or just the lives literally of 70 dudes from the time they're born till they have a kid of their own, right? We really don't know. But if you actually do, according to the official timeline, it's really interesting. If you actually add 70 times 70, it actually leads right up to the late 1700s to the early 1800s, right in there. It's perfect timing for the mud flood, for their release. And it says that when they're released, it's right at the time, right before they're judged in the lake of fire. So we can actually, hopefully I'm not losing anybody here. I'm trying to give a lot of details in a little bit of time. Let me talk really quickly here about when the Watchers return, which is, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe it's documented in chapter 56 of Enoch. 53 is a really interesting chapter. I'll get to that because that talks about when New Jerusalem appears, and it perfectly mirrors 2nd Ezra chapter 13, when all the nations turn against each other. But we see that in chapters 56 that there's a spiritual component behind that. Who is turning everyone against New Jerusalem? Well, it's Satan and his angels, right? So it says in chapter 56, let's see, in those days, the angels shall return and gather together and throw themselves to the east on the Parthians and Medes, or the Medes, I'm sorry. They shall stir up the kings. So it sounds a lot like Revelation here, right? They shall stir up the kings, so that a spirit of unrest and disturbance will come on them, and they shall drive them from their thrones, and they may rush out like lions from their lairs, and as hungry wolves among the flocks. And they shall go, now this is great, more Tartarian territory, and they shall go and trample the lands of my elect ones, and the land of his elect ones shall be before them a threshing floor, trampled, barren ground, and a highway. But the city of my righteous ones shall be a hindrance to their horses, and they shall begin to fight among themselves, and their own right hand shall be strong against themselves. And a man shall not know his brother, nor a son his father or his mother, until there will be innumerable corpses because of their slaughter, and their punishment shall be not in vain. Again, this sounds like 2nd Ezra chapter 13. We see this is a perfect matchup here of Revelation when the kings of the earth attack the battle of Armageddon. But also we see that we see that they're actually trampling down all of the elect lands, and the land of his elect ones shall be before them a threshing floor. But the one thing they can't attack that causes total confusion and the destruction of everybody is the city of the righteous ones. So we have to ask ourselves, where is the city of the righteous ones, right? This is what we see in Revelation chapter 20, when Satan is released for a season after 1,000 years, and he goes about the whole world, the plains of the earth, to deceive everyone into what? Into surrounding the camp of Yah. And this, of course, is to their demise. Everybody's destroyed. So this is where it's, my suggestion that this camp may actually be in the North Pole. This is what they're actually trying to hide from us up there, why it's blacked out on the map, why nobody can go there. That the whole Earth is literally surrounding it on a flat AE projection map. And that's what everything is leading to. So when we look at these big, beautiful buildings all over the world, I talked to you about Charleston, but you can drive anywhere in the United States. You can go, I was driving through Tennessee, I was driving through Missouri, and, you go to Springfield and you see this big, beautiful, like marble Corinthian pillared building with gold domes, and like nothing around it even compares to it in its beauty and its splendor. And you look it up and it's really shady. There's no blueprints anywhere. There's no construction photos. They just tell you that, some cowboys on horseback built it in the 1880s. You know what I'm talking about? This is this may be on Enoch's calendar in the 8th week, where we're seeing the righteous all over the world build these houses. And it says that the Holy One, the Messiah, also has a house. I often wonder, well, what was it? Was it the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. that kind of caused me to shiver a little bit? But or is it that big, beautiful? Is it the Palace of Versailles right outside of Paris? You know, it's a stunningly beautiful building if you've ever been there. That could house hundreds of people in it. Or that big, beautiful building in Venice, Italy, where, you know, literally like, sorry if women get upset about this, but like maybe John in the resurrection Isaiah says that a man will have 7, you know, wives at minimum. Like maybe he had 100 wives. I don't know, but anyways, that's kind of an overarching view here of what we're looking at. So I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on this, and if you have any questions.
Great brief intro.
Well, yeah, that was my intro and what I had prepared for tonight. I did want to go over really quickly before we get just on the 70 shepherds as well, because we were talking about that last week, and they their destruction leads right up to the Enochian calendar. And I just want to point out that when it says that they are judged and destroyed, that it's still future tense, even though it's written as past tense. It's obviously written by Enoch before the flood, and this is a way post-flood event. So I was trying to figure out, like, have these 70 shepherds been destroyed yet? And of course, it's my contention that they have not, that the judgment hasn't come for the angelic beings yet. They haven't been thrown into the lake of fire.
What's interesting is there's many different calendars, whether you go by the Jewish or the Chinese, that put us at different years, not 2021 or whatever one we're being peddled. So in this way, we can throw those right out the window and go, look, they don't even match up in terms of where we're supposedly at. So it gives us that clue again, not that we know something, it's that, no, we're being lied to across the board. So it's almost like we've been out of time, or we've been out of time. That's
well,
almost,
you know what, I've suggested in the past that I've speculated in the past that we're only about 1,000 to 1,200 years removed from Messiah. And the more I'm looking at Enoch's calendar, I've been looking at it for the last year and really pondering. I haven't written any articles on it because I've just been really trying to think through it and pass it by people. And people are kind of, not too many people are getting back to me on it. They don't really know what to do with it. But I actually kind of speculate that we really are almost 2,000 years removed from his first coming. Mind you, you still have 1,000 years of the millennial reign in there, where they would have been ruling all over the earth. And of course, just if anyone has any questions on that, well, what happens to them? Because one of the biggest things I get is, well, wait a second, I thought it was supposed to be an eternal kingdom. And it is an eternal kingdom. I believe it's still here on the earth somewhere. And even though I may sound a little delirious saying that, it says in Enoch that the Watchers will be released right before the throne in the lake of fire, and they're going to bring all the kings to battle. So that's going to happen. And secondly, it says in Revelation, which is a perfect matchup, that after the millennial kingdom, Satan will be released after 1,000 years, and he will tempt, or rather deceive, the entire world. Well, how do you deceive the entire world unless if Yahusha exits the stage? I guess you could argue he could still deceive the whole world if Yahusha is sitting on a throne and they could go talk to him. But the way I see this going down is that one day Yahusha's there with all his saints, and they're in all their houses, and they're like, all right, guys, we're going to pack it up and we're going to go up to our camp, up our fortified city up in the center of the earth on the mountain, the sides of the north, or whatever they call it. If that's where Eden originally was. And we're going to be up there for a couple hundred years. And this is all, part of the great contest. We're going to have a whole, keep in mind that during the millennial reign, we know it says in the book of Isaiah that not everybody's going to be on board with it. People are still going to have free choice to the choice to choose or reject the Messiah, even while he's on the earth ruling as king. And there will be people who will choose not to go to the holy city and participate in Passover, right? And he says that those people those nations would be cursed if they didn't do it. Well, what happens when you have people all over the world who chose not to do it? Well, they're not going to go with Yahusha when he exits the stage. They're going to be the people we see in all the photographs in the 1800s, kind of walking around these huge cities that are built, like it was skyscrapers, and we only see them on horseback and carriages, and no way to build these cities, and they're walking around kind of like dumbfounded, like, how did I get here, right? Like, they're just what we call the inheritors, right? And so that's us. We're descended from these inheritors who didn't make the cut. Either way, that the theology works out the same. I mean, I truly believe that we are Israel, and we're still waiting the final unification of Judea and Israel, which I don't believe happens until the very, very end. So that still all works out the same.
Quick question, Noel.
Yeah.
Or somewhat of an observation, but I'm just curious if you've come across it. It seems like, and I'm not sure exactly where the verse is, but I'm sure everybody here is familiar with it. Is at the end it'll be just like the days of Noah, with the the intermingling of species, and a lot of I know a lot of people seem to indicate that it's actually technological. So the Watchers, when they came down and mixed themselves with humans and created the Nephilim, that there was a technological element to that that allowed them to do like genetic splicing, and maybe that's partly what the dinosaurs are all about, and some of these other just gigantic crazy creatures that are maybe part Nephilim. But it seems like in the last, or almost the same timeline between when you were kind of indicating when the mud flood may have happened, and now it's like technology didn't exist and then it existed. And it's freaky when you look at it, just how quickly technology has just completely engrossed the entire world.
Not just technology, but like psychology and all the modern archaeology, and all the ologies, all the studies of everything just came. Think of like oh man, guys, I'm going blank right now. I have a whole list of an article where I just go down a whole list of 50 things that all developed out of nowhere in the 1800s, just came on the scenes. But you're looking at even discovery of like Antarctica, right? Like that happened, maybe it was the late 1700s, early 1800s. But you have Antarctica being discovered, and Australia, and just out of
America.
nowhere. Well,
this is the lie. Like as what's being in it, we use the word discovered. No, what's being revealed to us again. And a lot of it was like, it's brand new. And it's like, no, man, all this tech is old tech. There's been images people have shown like that even in the beginning of the 1900s, they were using wireless technology. And they were like, and then they had to cover those up real quick, because they were letting that technology out too fast again, in a way. So we get drawn into this false narrative again with the technology and the rollout of it as some advancement, when the great thing about the mud flood in 70 AD, we look back and put the timeline together and went, no way, you couldn't have built that with where we were supposedly at in a technological age. So we know advanced tech. We can go into the myths that we know weren't really myths. So if we remember that, so they didn't discover anything. It's almost like this is brought out for a new age again. I just remember just Brave New World. Like we got wiped, like you described earlier, and now they slowly rolled out the tech and then just ramped it up real fast. But here's the thing. As they did this, it showed their hand again. It revealed, wait a second. And this is the great thing about Yahuwah. He's the one showing us all of this. He's the one who showed us, hey, look again at where you're standing. Hey, look again at so-called history. Hey, look at these buildings. We weren't discovering anything. These were being revealed at the right moment, at the end, to show us. So we were, in a way, it looks like we're under a great spell with this technology. No, it's showing us the great spell we were under. So now it's like, yeah, please.
Yeah, I theorize the same thing, that like you look at the Pulitzer Prizes, and you see all these different discoverers who it's almost like they were chosen to discover these things, and it's all a part of the script. I just went through that whole series on the atomic bomb, and you see these different stages in history where all of a sudden they need to. Sometimes they're very good at pulling the timeline together in an orderly fashion, but then there's these other times where they need to quickly, get something done. So obviously, for the whole Zionist agenda, they needed the atomic bomb before the war came to an end. They had time to develop the Holocaust. Like the Holocaust didn't really started really developing until after the war was over, when they started coming up with the stories. And it started with the Soviets and Soviet intel giving some really crappy intel on the Holocaust, which has all been disproven now, but the myth has already been built off of it anyways. But they had to start developing this atomic bomb within like 6 months or something. I mean, it was just incredible how fast, because if the war ended and they didn't have the bomb, like the bomb wasn't about ending the war. It was about, continuing this Cold War narrative, right? You had to have the bomb to have the Cold War, and have, Israel be under threats of annihilation and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, so another thing that developed in the 1800s was a lot of the map making. So, and this is something that I put a lot of thought into this last year. And just so everybody knows, I've conceded, and I'm not arguing that Israel is not the historical Israel. Let's just say it is. But nevertheless, I'm looking at a lot of stuff. I always try to tell people, put yourself into the shoes of someone living in the 1800s. Nobody knows who Zionism is yet. Like the movement didn't really start taking off to like what, the 1880s, 1817, 1880s, right in there. And in the 1840s, you had the sudden emergence of Mormonism. And the Mormons are fascinating in their early connotation because John Smith, Brigham Young, those guys were Freemasons. They were all Freemasons. And they're coming up with this stuff about how America is the Holy Land. And Mormonism was incredibly popular in the 1840s and 1850s. You convinced a lot of Americans that America, the New World, was in fact the Old World. Pretty crazy to think about. And there was no Holy Land at that time. There was Palestine, but there was no Zionist Jewish state. And in fact, when the Zionists started looking to put their where they were going to put their Zionist state, they were looking at Texas, they were looking at New York, they were looking at Madagascar and South Africa. I think they were looking at a European continent at one time, and they finally settled on Palestine. It wasn't until the 1880s, 1890s when the map makers started showing up, and archaeology was still in its heyday. I should say in its infancy, and they started discovering places to put on the map. They sent in Agent Mark Twain, to go in there and be a spokesman for Palestine, and all of a sudden they started discovering things. You guys see how this works, right? And all of this developed post mud flood. How we're informed of our entire existence. All of this comes after 1800. So
Dude, we've been lied to so much. It's you just reminded me. There's like a Palestine, Texas. They've been. If you look at what people, I mean, just look at Russia, for example, and the different lies they have grown up with in the past century. The changes that they've gone through. Like and we can see it from the outside going, wow, you guys really went through some, and still we don't know the truth. And ours has been more like, we were cowboys and now we were, you know, city people, where it's so, so many different stories all around the world. And it's kind of like all being wrapped up now. So everyone can kind of see this general lie of we're trying to figure out a history where I'm like, it's been presented differently to different people. Like some of the people in the Pacific Island and the 40s, they believe in, the cargo cow. Jesus was this the guy who came on the plane. So lots of different false, like you said, like Mark Twain going around, lots of different narratives all over the world. But so we can't get lost in trying to figure out what happened. It's like who shot, not who shot JR, right? Not who shot JFK, who shot JR, to remind us we're in a soap opera. Let's not try and figure out what is it showing us today, because it's like the lies my history teacher told me. We're not going to make enough sense. We're not going to get the full truth out of it. We're going to get enough, but it's what I'm trying to share is we still got to keep our eyes to the front, eyes on Yah, right? Not get lost in the lies. Keep coming back to here, because wow, what's interesting is in this revelation, the word glory just keeps coming. Mercy and glory, grace and glory. And we've been in a grace period, and I'm feeling the glory period coming real soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it says that when the yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and this is one of the things that I kind of shied away. And I'm talking about this tonight because there's a lot of interest about it, and I've been getting a lot of comments about it. I've shied away from talking about the mud flood because when you go into this and you realize that you really don't know what is true and not about history. Most of it, when you look at a lot of the Tartarian mud flood channels, they tend to be very anti-biblical. And they'll say, oh, they just wrote the Bible in the 1800s. So they made the whole thing up to control you, right? And I know, I mean, my perspective is, because I'm a guy, as you guys know, that write about how they're lying about everything. And our whole reality is conjured around us by the media and intel. It's all, fabricated. It's all a script. But the one thing that is ultimately true for me is the Creator, who has revealed himself. And who has he revealed himself as? He's revealed himself as Yahuwah, the Most High. And Scripture tells his story. And you remove that, and then it's like, well, what do you have to work with? You have nothing to work with. At that point, I'm just making up my own God, right? And it's I believe that the reason, one of the biggest testimonies as to why the Bible is true in the face of all these lies is that you can look all over the world on every single continent and every culture. And I've said this before, I'll say it again tonight. You could see, you see them talk about paradise, the Garden of Eden. You see them talking about the tree of life, how every culture is pursuing the tree of life. You hear about the worship of the serpent. You hear about the watchers coming, the ascended masters, or the ancient aliens, or whatever you want to call them, who came and took human wives. You hear about the giants on every culture. You hear about the Tower of Babel on every culture. You hear about the flood on every culture. The one thing that separates the Bible from all of these other nations and cultures is that it's the only one that exposes the serpent for who he is. It's the only one that exposes all the mystery religions and all the people that are telling you they're pursuing the tree of life, when in fact they're selling you a counterfeit, and it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's the promise that you are divine within, that you can become like Elohim, and that you can go in the back way, jump over the wall, go into the back door into heaven. And we know that the Bible is the only one that exposes that. It's the only one that in Psalm 82 where the Most High says to his council, why his divine ones who are ruling over the earth, saying, why aren't you teaching them my law? Right? Because everybody hates his law. Nobody wants to be a part of it. They all want the counterfeit, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. not the tree of life, who is, of course, Yahusha as well, our tree of life. So that's why I believe is you strip away the Bible and you've got the mystery religions. That's all you've got. You go back to the Matrix. You take the red pill, you become divine. The whole lie. You have no other option.
So, just a follow up there, Noel. Actually, one quick comment and then the follow up. So funny thing I saw recently in the media, and I don't absorb a lot of media, but this whole is like Israel getting bombed or something. And the one thing I noticed was that Israel or Jerusalem is protected by an iron. They call it an iron dome.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everybody, some other people have seen that. It's just kind of ironic, the iron dome, and then you have the firmament being a dome. So, and it's protecting like the quote unquote chosen land, which I'm not 100% certain that's not a false flag operation by the Jesuits, but it could be misdirection. But the follow up to that whole thing, Noel, is if everything you say is actually true regarding the timeline, where does that put us in terms of prophecy, and what's kind of up on the plate? What's kind of up next? Because a lot of us are, I'm sure a lot of us are preppers. A lot of us are like, we see technology and COVID especially, and socialist governments and tyrannical governments coming in. So a lot of us are probably preparing for that kind of eventuality, looking to try to get off grid, looking to try to grow our own food, provide for our family in other ways that technology doesn't necessarily adhere to. But what does that mean for Revelation timeline, as far as what we should be doing as the body, other than of course obviously pursuing a daily relationship with Yah, and I think pursuing a connection to the place where we're put, creation and nature around us.
Okay, there was a lot in there. So let's start back at what you started talking about was Iron Dome, and it's really interesting that right now, as we speak, there was, I don't know how has it been 1,000? I don't know how many missiles or rockets were shot at Israel from its neighbors in Palestine, and as far as I'm concerned, Iron Dome is a total hoax. They're trying to sell you on the fact that it's kind of like the atomic bomb. There has to be this threat to legitimize the existence of the United Nations, of Israel, and so on and so forth. That's what the atomic bomb is, right? Well, how do they explain that? It's kind of like when you look at the moon today and like nobody's landing on the light side of the moon. They're all going to the dark side because we have telescopes and we could go look and go, why aren't you landing on where we can see you, right? So we ask the question, why isn't Jerusalem getting bombed? Oh, well, they have the Iron Dome, right? Well, actually, nobody's trying to bomb Jerusalem, and it's all made up. And this is, how sick our slave masters are, that they're actually playing both sides. They don't want shalom in the Middle East. If they wanted shalom in Israel, there would be shalom in Israel. The Palestinians are set up that way. It's like I wrote in a paper, and I did it in a podcast as well, that the Temple Mount is not the location of Solomon or Herod's temple. The Bible tells us where it was. It was on Mount Zion. And you go to Wikipedia today, they'll admit to the fact that, oh yeah, well that was Mount Zion, but then they changed the name of Mount Zion to the Temple Mount. Oh, sure they did. Everybody knows that the temple was on Mount Zion, but nobody wants to build the temple. They're telling you it's the Temple Mount so they can create this whole, who put Muhammad on the Temple Mount? Rome did, right? And who runs Zionism? Rome runs Zionism, and the whole thing is a setup, right? They don't want any peace. They're almost like using biblical prophecy as a blueprint of deception. Interestingly enough. And so it's kind of interesting to watch what's happening over there right now, and how the commenters are saying like this is like coming out of nowhere, and they don't know where this is leading. It's leading somewhere. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So where we're at on the time, go ahead.
Oh, it looked like the video. It looked like the video game Missile. Remember Missile Command?
Yeah, I do. I do. So, and that actually goes into addressing where we're at on the timeline. I could read Revelation 20 if you would like, but it talks about right when you go through the 1,000 years of shalom on earth in the millennial reign. Then every single time I tell people about how we're in Revelation 20, they're like, "Well, that can't be because when the millennial reign." Let me start again. My entire life, I was raised in churches where they were really big on eschatology, and they would talk about the millennial reign and how they can't believe that there'll be people on the earth who will still reject. We would say Jesus back then. They'll reject Jesus even when he's king of the earth. But that's the state, the sinful state of humanity, which is absolutely true. But then they'll say, but what's really crazy then is that Satan will be released and he'll deceive everybody. What is that going to look like? Well, as soon as you then infer that the millennial reign has already happened, they'll then change their story and say, yeah, but his kingdom is forever. Well, I know it's forever, but it says right here that Satan will be released to deceive everybody. So it's the same thing in Enoch, that the Watchers will do that. So that's precisely where we're at in the timeline. Where I can't, when I look around at the world, that's why I put that emphasis on Israel. And I don't even, like I said, I don't even know that is the historical state of Israel. They've lied to us about the shape of the earth. Why not lie to us about the shape of our inheritance too? It's just, I told you guys that I've kind of, dropped that. I'm just kind of content. Yeah, maybe when Yahusha shows up, he'll say, hey, you know what? Australia was the Holy Land, or the North Pole, or what I'm saying? I'll be like, cool. Like it won't be a shock to me. Because I've tried to make sense of the map, and I actually can't. When you look at starting at the Jordan River, going to the Mediterranean Sea, that whole section right there is about the size of LA County. It's really small. LA County's big, but it's also very small. And so you pack 10 tribes into that small area, and then you put, let's see, who was on east of the Jordan? Was it Manasseh? No, not Manasseh. Maybe someone could pull up a map and paste it on here. But you have 2 or 3 tribes east of the Jordan, and their boundary goes all the way to Babylon. And you're like, wait, what? It goes like 400 miles, according to our map. So everyone is congested in this little tiny area. And then these tribes get 400 miles all the way to the Euphrates River. It doesn't really make sense that much. And then you start looking at in 1 Samuel, where David is running from Saul or Shaul, and it talks about he's running through the wilderness to all these different cities, and he's hiding, and the whole army's pursuing them. And then you look at a map, and you're like, oh, he was running around in these 4 miles right here. Like it's just you get, when you read the Bible, you get a sense of a much larger area than what you're told, than what we see. So I say all that I also have not been content with looking at other maps. Some people are pushing that it's actually South Africa. We had someone on in this Discord channel for a while who was pushing Spain. It's kind of interesting. But I haven't seen the proof that would go, yes, that's an undeniable proof. It's really Spain or South Africa.
So
or the United States. But my point is that when I look around at the world, I see that we're being lied to about everything. Everything we are being lied to. And I can't think of a better time on the prophetic timeline than the age of deception, when Satan is loose to deceive everybody. And what are we being deceived for ultimately? I mean, we're being deceived. I talk about all the psyops, and, we talk about vaccinations and COVID and all these things. Ultimately, where it's all leading is to surround the camp of Yah. Where is that? I think it's on the earth somewhere. I'm saying the North Pole. It would make sense because the whole earth surrounds it. And to fight to their destruction. We read in 2nd Ezra and Enoch and Revelation that everybody who goes up in this big end times battle against Yahusha, they will be utterly destroyed. As we read earlier tonight in Enoch, it says that brother will not recognize brother, and father and son, they'll all turn and kill each other. Like everyone's just going to turn and kill each other when I think when New Jerusalem comes down. So I think those are the 2 things we're waiting for. We're waiting for, I think, what's going to activate it. I don't know what's going to activate. I don't know if there's going to be a surrounding of the camp first, or New Jerusalem that comes down. But I think that's what we're waiting for. I think that's it. We're waiting for New Jerusalem to come down.
So,
So if
uh,
yeah, go on, please.
yeah, no, just kind of briefly, because you mentioned something about this, Noel, is Satan comes to deceive, but I mean, if we look around, if and I think everybody or most of the people here are Torah observant or working their way towards Torah observance, and if we think that Yahusha is the embodiment of Torah, and he's like the law manifest, which is just a representation of Yah's desire for how he wants his kingdom to look, then we can certainly see through modern Christianity, and certainly a lot of and not to be controversial, but a lot of Paul's God of grace mentality, that there's tons of paganism just intertwined with Christianity. You have Christians celebrating Christmas and Easter, which is Ishtar, and obviously Christmas has its own incredibly horrible pagan origins. So when Christians are like, oh, how could Satan possibly deceive everybody when Yahusha's on the earth? His Torah is on the earth still. His kingdom, Torah, it still is on the earth, and it hasn't left. But I would hazard maybe that's the great deception, is this whole idea that the law is done away with, and now it's just free reign to do whatever you want. Grace is just 100%, turn to the max, and then we'll have Yahusha's camp saying, hey, you guys need to return to my Torah, and you'll have these Christians who believe in grace saying, you're a bunch of liars and you're heathens and you're blasphemous, because honestly, when you talk to a Christian about Torah, they say, how dare you? You want to be under the law? Fine, go die. You're in judgment, blah, blah, blah. They turn it right around on you. And they can be very vicious about it, actually. I've noticed, even if you're coming at gently and just saying, hey, well, let's find evidence together. They're like, no, you're out to lunch. So that to me is like just that reaction and the irony of the whole thing. It would be very ironic at the end of the day for Christians who say, oh, how could he possibly deceive everybody? And oh, it turns out Torah was a big deal, guys. Crap.
Hey,
Yeah.
quick question. Would you say the Amish are Torah followers in many ways?
Well, I think I guess the question is, what is Torah observance? So this is always a tricky conversation to be in, because I heavily stress obedience to the Most High, and that is, to be set apart means that we are obedient to His law, right? To what makes Him set apart, right? So there's a number of ways to do that. Now, I'm trying to keep as much as I can of Torah by, I'm a Seventh-day Sabbath guy. I wear tassels. I'm trying the best I can to keep the feasts. I'm not a farmer, so I'm not out harvesting and stuff like that. It doesn't have the same connotations to me. But what I have found in my few years in this Torah journey, which, when I finally stumbled upon Torah, it was a joy to my heart. It was what I've been searching for my entire life. What I've been stumbling over in the Bible my entire life. It made total sense. But in the last few years, I see a lot of this pride of people who advertise themselves as Torah observant, but they have no love in their heart. They don't appear to have circumcised hearts at all, which is missing the entire point. So
You said the word pride, and this is
my wife.
That's the catch.
My wife, who's actually sitting in the room right now, and I'm not saying this because she's in the room, but I'm just recognizing the fact that she's listening to me talk about her best friend. She has a best friend who just grew up in the church as we did, very churchianity, but she has a love in her heart like I've never seen in almost anybody. Like she doesn't even know who Yahusha is. She calls him Jesus. And she follows what he said to do. Is she takes care of the widows, the hungry, the orphans, and she devotes her life to that. I mean, she missions nonstop. She has a love to feed and clothe people like I've never seen. Now, does she goes to church on Sunday? She doesn't keep Sabbath. She doesn't wear tassels, and she doesn't know what all the feasts are and all that kind of stuff. She's not educated in that. But in a lot of ways, she's embodying Torah in ways that so many in the Torah movement aren't even envisioning. They're just kind of all saying the right words and growing their beards all shaggy and so on and so forth. And so this is what Yahusha talked about, when he returns, that there's, you all know the famous phrase, but Lord, Lord, didn't I eat with you and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, get away from me. I don't know you, you worker of lawlessness, right? But then he's going to go up to all these people and have them enter their rest, their eternal rest, and be like, I don't even know who you are. And he's like, oh yeah, all those times you were like, visiting people in prison and feeding the hungry, you were feeding me and visiting me in prison. They're like, cool, right? So you get this idea that there's something about Torah that it really is, I hate to say it, but it really is a heart issue where there are many people who have been unfortunately taught that the law is done away with. And there's so much cognitive dissonance with that, guys. Like people like they
it's the word. They're caught up on the word. It's Torah or the law instead of Dad's rules. The Father's rules. You're in his house, follow his rules. So this is where the devil plays the trick. God's out of the picture, so we're not in his house, so there's no rules to follow.
Right. And this is where it really comes down to a heart issue where, obviously it's in my desire to get everybody to, I was just out there, I was witnessing to a Levite, someone who claims to be a Levite the other day. And he couldn't believe that I wouldn't be a Jew and I'd want to follow Torah. And I was, witnessing to him about, the house of Israel and he knew Israel was divorced and I'm claiming to be the house of Israel and I'm coming back. Here I am. And he was just listening and really. And so it's my desire to tell everyone about Yahusha and about the law being set apart. But I just think it's a very convoluted and it's a very difficult conversation to have because it really does come down to, has Yahuwah circumcised your heart or not? And we can't circumcise our own heart. It says in Deuteronomy that he has to do it. And so, yeah. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are indoctrinated, who I do believe have circumcised hearts, but they're fed very bad intel. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully that makes sense. So what I'm not doing is I'm not judging all the Christians out there who really do love Yah and want to be obedient to him, but are being fed lies. And I believe that Yah is a good judge. And he's going to say, all those things you did it for me. Even though you didn't know you were doing it, you did it for me. And then many, many people who, claim to be doing everything for him and doing it right, if they don't have the right heart, if they're full of pride and if they're doing it for themselves. I mean, this gets into you had asked the question earlier, Josh, about survival. This is something I kind of try to avoid because this gets me into a lot of trouble with people. This is where, I am in full support of everyone needs to prepare for the future. Prepare your households, food, supplies, all the things you need. We see these examples in scripture with Joseph in Egypt. One thing that I do find concerning about the survival crowd is that I have talked to so many over the last couple of years, and in almost all the conversations I've had, I never hear coming out of their lips that Yah is going to save them. I never hear that. It's always how they're going to save themselves, how, Yah wants them to save themselves, that they're going to do it. They have this pride in the fact of how many guns they own, how much food they have, how much land they owned, and all these things. And I asked myself, and I'm not judging them, but I see these trends, and I have to ask, when that moment comes for the Exodus, and they have to drop everything. They can't take anything with them. They can't take any of that food they stored up, any of those weapons they stored up. They have to, throw in a backpack with, a change of underwear and a couple, whatever. And you have to walk out that door, and you have to leave your house, your property, your farm, everything behind. How many people who said they were doing all that for the Most High are going to do it and go through with it? That's the question I ask.
So I really think it's a correction of the heart. So that's the big.
It always comes down to that, doesn't it? And that's the thing that everyone has to evaluate. And I can't judge people individually. I could say, excuse my
So
for
what
my
you just
French.
described, and this is where I go to people. You could do all of that, but again, where's your focus? Your focus is on the world. If you remember, if you focus on Yah, he's whatever the example is in front of you. His is trying to correct your heart. Are you full of pride that you can't take my correction? Whether it's be kinder, smile, help out, whatever it may be, it's this correcting of your heart. That's what we got in front of us, not death and destruction in the world. The world's been going through this for quite a while, and we know we're at the at quite a time, and it really depends on what neighborhood you're in, because some neighborhoods are really bad. Thank Yah that yours isn't. Doesn't mean everywhere has to. So what does that show us? Again, yes, be prepared, but the really thing to be prepared for is for the correction, to receive that correction. Are you ready? When you're provided the answer, can you accept it?
Yeah. I want to quickly go back and just talk about the deception that you had pointed out, Josh, on the law. And that's absolutely true. And I don't believe that's just an end times deception. I believe that it's always been the deception from day one. You see that going back to Mount Sinai with the golden calf. You see that going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That when you recognize that the tree of knowledge ultimately represents mankind. We went through this in the Targum, where I don't know if you were there for that week, but where it said that Adam and Eve were already wise. They were already wise. They didn't need wisdom. What the tree of knowledge, good and evil, represented was wisdom in their own eyes. It meant that they knew better than following Yah's law, and they could worship him however they wanted, however they saw fit. That's what it represents. And we could see that manifest everywhere in life. You just look around, you could see the knockoff tree of life, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I made a note when we were going through our Torah portions as a family this last Sabbath in somewhere in Leviticus, where it talks about how it was prophesying that Israel would be abolishing the laws. And I think that I don't think, when we talk about controversial subjects like Paul and the Christians of Antioch who did away with the law and said that they didn't have to follow that anymore, I don't think that was anything new. I think it happened all throughout Israel's history. That's why within 2 or 3 generations or whatever in Israel, they didn't even know what the law stated anymore. They just weren't interested in it because they abolished it. I think there were probably prophets that came along and, I said that. So, it's always been the deception.
Look at today. Look at today in Israel. Everyone must get vaccinated, and if you're not, basically you got to put the yellow star on again.
Yeah.
People are like, you don't see this? I'm in Hawaii. I'm like, and I live on Molokai. That's where the leper colony is, on the backside of the mountain. I'm sitting on this side, it's on the other side. And I'm like, people, Hawaiians, remember, it happened here. No, this ain't the same thing. I'm like, okay, whatever. This is another version. So does this need to go much further? No, it needs to go enough where people then turn to Yah and go, wait a second, and then put their eyes back correct, put their heart back to correct, to go, this is happening.
Lisa, did you unmute yourself? Did you have something you wanted to ask or say?
I did. I was just going to wait until we're breaking that conversation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Because I'm outside and I wasn't sure if this was going to carry or not. When you were speaking of deception earlier and about the church and the 1,000 years, in Revelation 20, most of the Christians that I know, the church family, are waiting for Gog and Magog to happen. That's what their marker is. Not realizing that happens after the 1,000 years. That's after Satan's been released. So they deep down know that that the 1,000 years may have already happened. They just don't realize, because the church tells them that the timeline is wrong. They don't realize that what they're actually waiting for, they're acknowledging that it is after the 1,000 years.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you brought that up. Dave's in the room, and he's talked to me about this before, and so I'll give him credit for this because I wasn't the first person to say it. That when you look at history, it seems like even the history of the Bible, even before the flood, after the flood, leading up to Messiah, it seemed like everybody knew where they were at in history. Like in their heart, they knew where they were at. And we see that, today if you were to take a survey as to where we're at in history, it seems like over the last 200 years, not just this generation, it's been ongoing. The baby boomers, it was really huge, the end times. But it seems like everybody has this idea that we're coming up with this culmination of the end of all things. And I love that you brought that up about Gog and Magog and Armageddon, because you're absolutely right that prophetically it happens after the millennial reign. You see that all through scripture. And yet why is everybody so big on this and feel like it's around the corner? This, it's all going to go down with China, and it's all going to lead to Armageddon. So that's really interesting, because that is obviously, if we are past the millennial reign, that's what we're waiting for. And isn't this like, it's the first time you hear about this, it's almost really unsettling. Like, it's a really unsettling thought that a lot of people don't get through. Like, what? We missed the millennial reign? But it's almost like being in an episode of The Twilight Zone. It's the ultimate reveal, that we think that it's all future tense. It's almost like, I love that show, The Twilight Zone. Did you guys ever see that episode where there's like a captain and a clown and a ballerina, and they're all in this like white room, and there's no ceiling. They can look up and see the moon, and they're all trying to figure out where they came from, where they're going, where they're at. And they finally concoct this plan to climb out. I think it's the clown or something. I can't remember who finally, they like climb up the wall and he falls out. And then you find out at the end they were just these toys in a box. But I almost feel like that's where we're at in history right now, where we don't know like what was before us, how long we've had, where we're at. We don't even know how big the earth is. I don't know. So.
Hey, Noah, I got a question. So who do you think we are? Are we the children of the orphan trains? Are we the descendants of the nations outside the New Jerusalem? Like, who do you think we are?
Yeah, well, I don't believe that New Jerusalem has come down yet. This is why I said earlier today that, so I guess you could argue that we are in the outer darkness. I guess you could argue that, depending on how you view what the outer darkness is. What I said earlier, it doesn't really change whether we're the children of the orphan train or the children of Israel, because either way, we are still, the story is still the same, with humanity being disowned by the Most High at Babel, and then Israel being cast out into the Gentiles, and then the promise in the end that Yehuda and Israel would be reunited into one flock, which I don't believe has happened yet fully, right? Like we've still, it has happened in past forms, but in its ultimate fulfillment at the end of times, I've pointed out that I don't really know who Yehuda is or Israel. I don't know. Maybe I'm the tribe of Yehuda. Maybe I'm a Levite. I have no clue. I'm not really interested in all that, the DNA that they found that traces them back to Babylon. The Levite I was just talking to the other day, he was saying how he traced his blood back to Babylon. I'm like, woohoo, good job. He found out you're a Babylonian. And so, I just wrote a paper. It's going to be published in the next few weeks on how I don't believe any of the Jews that are over in Israel right now are the real Yehudim from the Bible. They're actually the Edomites. And, we read that throughout Scripture that the final culmination of all things, Yahuwah says over and over again in Ezekiel, Isaiah, it's that he has a point of contention with the people who are inhabiting the land, which are the Edomites, the sons of Esau. And so if we look at Israel today, and if that's the real state of Israel, then we have to ask, well, who's filling that land? According to the Bible, it's the Edomites, right? So I say all that because it means that the real Yehudim and the real Israel are all over the earth, and I believe that's us. So it doesn't, whether we're the children of the orphan train. I did say earlier that if the millennial reign happens and they move somewhere else, it means that we are descended from the people. Our ancestors were those who obviously did not love Yah. And we could see that either way, right? Our ancestors did not love Yah. If we are descended from Israel, we were, they were a bunch of disobedient sheep who were cast out from the flock. And we're the people that are waking up in the end and remembering who Yah is and saying his name again and, throwing our idols out.
Speaking of the orphan trains, since that would have been along the time frame of the mud flood and the Tartarian, who do you think the children were? Where did they come from?
Well, that's good question. So in the 1800s, there was, and this is another thing that totally came together for me with the mud flood, because I had been interested in this strange narrative of all the orphans all over the world in the 1800s for a long time. I could never make sense of it. Another thing that was born in the 1800s was literature, the modern novel. Think of Charles Dickens, right? Robert Louis Stevenson, all those guys. And one of the big things they wrote about was orphans. Orphans show up in all their stories. They're everywhere. Why are all these authors? You think of like not just Little Orphan Annie. She came along in the 20th century, but Anne of Green Gables, right? Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. They're all orphans. And so there was, in the 1800s, orphans being shipped all over the world to Australia, to Russia.
Shirley Temple.
Yeah, Shirley Temple. Yeah, always playing an orphan. Yeah. And to the point that like they just had babies being dropped off in firehouses and police departments, and you had these huge, beautiful buildings that were being repurposed as orphanages and others as insane. A lot of people went into insane asylums too. That's the other thing we have to remember, that all of a sudden insane asylums became a big thing in 1800s when a bunch of people who probably weren't playing along with the program were being deemed insane and being, they had vaccinations back then and drugs. They were probably giving them, the original MK Ultra program.
Didn't you write about it, Noel? Like when the mud flood happens, there was basically a war. And kind of the image I'm reminded of is one of the Indiana Jones movies when they were in India, and when they finally defeated them, all the kids came up out of the mines and were free. Yeah. And it was like, where's all the adults? It was like this, man. There was some dark stuff happening. And it wasn't so much orphan trains. It was like they weren't orphans. These were like casualties of war.
Right. And that's the only thing I could think of all these orphans, that there was a large amount of the adults of that generation in the 1800s that were killed off for whatever reason. They were judged. Maybe it was worldwide wars. We call them the Napoleonic Wars. I have pointedly stated that both Napoleonic Wars, not just 1812, but also the 1860s with Napoleon III, also line up perfectly with the War of 1812 in America and the American Civil War. And we see that they were going around burning and destroying the ancient world. A lot of people dying.
So the history in Hawaii, like they know the different, like they say, from Polynesia. And one of the ones when the Kapu system came, who was from Tahiti, and he was a sorcerer named Pahoa or something like this. And what he came and did, and it's in records, but people are like thinking that what he did, he killed everyone who believed in the one true God before, and then put in that system of many gods and everything. And people are like, everyone was pagan before. No, everyone basically believed in one true God all over the world. And then when that got released, even here, you kind of have a record of it, but what happened before got erased. So our real connection to like the millennial, we were living in the millennial reign before that, or people were, and then this happened. So you have this record here. And so why don't we why isn't there anything? Because they came and killed any priest, anybody who still would not bow down. And so where were the people? They were wiped out quite easily. Where's the
Right.
record? There wouldn't be any. The new history presented. Hey, now it's all kapu, all taboo. You can't do this. You can't question this. Here's the rise of all the monarchies all over the world. And here's the story. Here's all the world's a stage, at the Globe Theater.
Exactly. I had a thought and then I totally lost it just now. Well, yeah. So when we look at all this mud flood talk is really taking off right now. Like I started out saying how, early 2019, it seemed like the mud flood channels were still, 10,000, 20,000 subscribers. And then like now they're like 150, like they've really taken off this last year. And they're not, I'm watching some of these videos and they're talking about how the whole purpose was to like steal free energy and things like that. Like I get it. Yeah. We shouldn't be paying for our energy, but it seems like such a shallow reason for why they would, do this huge worldwide reset. The millennial reign makes total sense, 100% total sense that they would have to try to erase that. So going back to these orphan trains and, when you look at these worldwide, these world fairs, the Chicago World Fair of 1890, was it 1891, 92, right in there. And of course, all these world fairs happen to follow in these big destructive fires, whatever, like the Chicago fire, Mrs. O'Leary's cow. And so that World Fair ushered in millions upon millions of Americans in the 1890s when they were on horseback and carriages. And they were able to usher in millions of people from all over the U.S. who had to tend to farms, who were farmers for profession, had to get up and leave all that. And also people from Europe who came over by boat and then train in order to see this ancient city get destroyed in front of their eyes, right? Like when you understand, when you understand that the 1800s was a big indoctrination event in order to rewrite history right in front of them and lie to them about everything. It makes so much sense of how, that again, what is the point of all this deception is to actually turn against the Most High. That's what Satan's trying to do. It makes total sense. Why
Okay,
he's
you were
doing all of
gonna write about the Wild West. Remember, how popular the Louis L'Amour books are.
Yeah.
Like before, like the kind of I'm born came in 69, so kind of I was at the end of it, but before it's so popular, and you'll see like you go Germany, there's so much into cowboys and the Native American culture over here, especially Native American culture. But something that you were shedding light on is like in this I remember one time you're like, yeah, I don't believe the Wild West either. I remember you saying something like this, and I was like, all right, this is great because this part of the timeline is like, yeah, they made that stuff up too.
It was really hard because I love Western films. I love, like, one of my favorite films of all time is High Noon with Gary Cooper. And just a classic showdown in the streets type of film. And it was really hard for me to give up the Western. It's so much of my identity, so many Americans' identities are grounded in this, but when you just see all these big, beautiful buildings, we've been over this, like in Texas and Colorado, and these dome buildings. It's like there's no, as you guys know, there's no way that cowboys went and built that stuff.
It's kind of like Westworld, the last season of Westworld, where they realized it's like when they got out of that one, I want to say dome, that one, what would you call it? Almost like a, what do we get so-called on the moon? The craters, more like a crater, right? Like we're supposedly in a crater with the south pole surrounding us, right? Antarctica surrounding us, and we're within a bowl in a way. So that's kind of like in Westworld was presented, and then when they got out, there was feudal Japan, there was modern modern high-tech America, there was the Westworld, there was all these different simulations, but real life simulations going on all over the place. So this is kind of how, if you look at it and the way history is presented, this is a very good putting it in our faces, kind of what's been happening.
Yeah. So, guys, it's 10:30, and I want to answer any more questions you guys have tonight. If you guys have any final thoughts, we can kind of wrap up in the next 10, 15 minutes. And then next week, Rick Hummer really wants to come on and talk to you guys about this, and he would have a very interesting conversation. So we're going to plan on it again next week, but if he, for whatever reason, for work reasons, is not able to do it, has to cancel, we'll just continue with the Targum study. The next chapters, we'll have those ready just to have something to go. But is there any other comments or any questions people have over anything that we've covered so far tonight?
Observation about the orphan trains. If it was after the millennium and the adults that went to war against the camp of Yah, the children, if you've ever, and I'm sure a lot of you have, studied the orphan trains and looked at them, all the children are below the age of accountability. They're all, they were all able to, to work. They weren't like kids today. If you took them and put them in a factory, they wouldn't know what to do. But I just find it interesting that they were all below the age of accountability, and like maybe they're the remnant of what was left after the camp of Yah was surrounded.
Well, yeah, now that's an interesting thought too, that they would have already surrounded the camp. My idea is that battle has not happened yet. The surrounding the camp battle, what we call Gog Magog, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's a interesting observation, and it's so strange how they try to explain to us that they had to have all these kids go work in these factories back then. I don't even know what they expect. I've seen some explanations that there was just too much work, and that it's like that they had all these jobs and not enough adults, and these. It's like
For who? Who are you building for? What are you making for?
Yeah, it's just so weird to see factory after factory on every continent filled with grubby-faced children, and it's like, where are all the adults? Why are all these kids working these jobs? It's something that it's just so bizarre.
Particularly referring to Gog and Magog, the last, the war where the camp surrounded, but just after the millennium, when Satan is released, there's a battle.
Yeah.
And I just theorize, use ancient alien terminology. I theorize that the children were maybe what was left of some type of battle.
Sure.
And they were not destroyed because they were below the age of accountability.
Right. Yeah. That could be. Yeah. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Okay, then. It's 10:30, and I want to be considerate of everyone's time. So as always, we will pick this up next week again. And thank you everybody for coming. Shalom. Hopefully this was good information for you guys. Hopefully it wasn't all too repetitive. I really the 10-week prophetic calendar of Enoch, I really want to get people's feedback on and say, okay, no, this is where you're wrong on this is where you're seeing it wrong, because I've been trying to really get people to comment on it for the last year. And it's why I haven't written any articles on it, because I just, to me, it looks more and more like it's describing, that we're kind of in the 9th week, going on, getting close to that, or I guess, was it the 10th? I'd have to look at it again. But anyways, the watchers aren't judged until the 10th week. So to me, and then it says, eternity picks up after the 10th week. So anyways, thanks everyone for showing up tonight.
Thanks, all.
We really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
All right. Shalom. All right, I'm signing up.
Shalom.